I was in charge of a camping trip for Girl Scouts. There were 2 other adults with me. One was looking after the kids, and the other was helping out. My job was to teach the kids about surviving in the wild. On our first day, we picked a spot to camp. I told everyone to set up their tents. I set up mine fast. Then, I told the other adults that I needed to go to the bathroom. I went a little far from where the kids were, dug a hole, and did what I needed to do. Then, I heard gunshots. Even though I wasn't done yet, I knew the kids might get scared, but I trusted the counselors to keep them safe. After I finished, I covered up everything, so there was no sign I was there, and went back to where the kids were camping. I got back about 5 minutes after the gunshots. Everything was chaotic. The girls were really scared. One girl had told everyone to put on camouflage clothes. Some did, but others didn't know what to do and asked me for help. I was wondering where the other adults were. I talked to the kids and told them that there were hunters around sometimes, but they weren't dangerous. I explained that wearing bright clothes was safer than camouflage. Then, I asked where the other adults were, but the kids didn't know. I found them in their tent, far from the kids. They were just chilling, reading magazines they brought with them and playing games. I was really surprised and upset. I got angry and yelled at them, asking why they didn't go see if the kids were okay when they heard the gunshots. They just shrugged and said, "We thought you had it covered." But I specifically told you both that I was going to the bathroom in the woods. It was your job to watch over the kids while I was gone. We expected you to take care of things until I returned. Anyway, I handled the situation with the kids, including the counselors. I bumped into the hunters while getting water, and I told them to avoid hunting near our campsite. When we returned to camp, I told my boss everything that happened. Those 2 staff members were never put in charge of a backpacking group again, and they weren't allowed to work together anymore. Thankfully, the kids still enjoyed the rest of the trip. This happened when I was in the 3rd year of high school, during spring break. My school was in a small town in Iowa, and it covered a few smaller areas nearby. In the summer of 2014, some friends and I started a film club. We made short movies and entered them into national competitions with other schools. We were a small group, and it was hard for us to meet up and film. But during spring break in 2015, we finally got a chance to go on a trip. 4 of us went, me, Jake, Bill, and Kyle from the club. We decided to go camping at Mossy Glen Hollow, a state park in northeastern Iowa that people say is haunted. Mossy Glen Hollow was known for its dense woods, mysterious trails, and rumors of ghost sightings. Since the 1850s, there were a lot of bad things happening at Mossy Glen, but, being adventurous teenagers, we were excited to go hiking and camping there. It was close to a small town, so getting food wasn't a problem. So, everything was good to go. We packed up 2 cars, set the GPS, and started our spring break adventure. About an hour and a half into the drive, my phone lost its signal. And then the GPS started telling us to go a different way. We didn't know where we were, or where Mossy Glen was supposed to be, so we had to just go along with the new directions. Let me tell you something about how land is laid out in Iowa, especially up north. The hills and terrain can be tricky, even in places you wouldn't expect. In some areas, there are parts of the land that are too steep or rocky for farming. Sometimes you find small flat areas surrounded by steep slopes, which makes farming really hard. Many farms keep it in the family for generations. So, the land either stays public, gets bought back by the state, or is given to the state or DNR. A lot of these areas become state parks or reserves, even though they're surrounded by private land. That's what happened with Mossy Glen Hollow. This is why we saw signs for private property near the lake, which was bought next to the creek filled with big rocks that couldn't be used. This detail is important for the story. So once we were really in the middle of nowhere, our GPS directed us off the main roads onto gravel ones. At this point, you'd normally see those brown signs from the Iowa DNR, showing you're close to a state park. But we didn't see any. There weren't even any clusters of trees to suggest a forest nearby. That was another warning sign. About 10 minutes later, the gravel road turned into dirt, then into a rough road, and finally into a road that barely got any maintenance, which is typical for Iowa. This means that someone probably checked out the area in the 90s and then forgot about it. As we turned the last bend in the road, according to the GPS, we saw a farmhouse with a big machine shed. There were no lights on, no one around, and no cars in the driveway. Feeling a bit uneasy about finding a house near what should have been a state park, we slowed down but kept driving. Unfortunately, the road turned into a mess of deep tire tracks left from the harvest last fall. We stopped the cars as far as we could without getting stuck in the frozen ruts, then unloaded some of our equipment. The road got narrower as it wound through a field, then dipped into a dense cluster of woods at the bottom of a wide ravine. We got out of the cars and started walking down the gradually steeper slope, enjoying the view. At first, everything seemed like a really cool place to film. There were some limestone formations jutting out from the hillside, a path with pretty trees hanging over it, and even some birds that had come back earlier than expected from their winter trip down south. We could hear water flowing, but we couldn't see where it was coming from along the trail. When we looked around, all we saw were trees stretching out as far as we could see. At the bottom of the hill, there was a small pond in a clear, grassy area with a fence around it. When we got closer to the fence, we saw a sign that said, "Private property." Bill looked at his watch and saw it was almost dinner time, so we turned back to our cars and set up the GPS. The closest town was called Edgewood, which had some diners and a gas station where we could get supplies for the week. We brought some canned food, but not much else. When we reached Edgewood, we found out it was even smaller than we thought, with less than 900 people living there. In these tiny towns, everyone knows each other. So, when 4 strangers showed up with plates from a faraway place, we got some strange looks. Kyle decided to ask the cashier and some people at the gas station about Mossy Glen Hollow and why the only way in seemed to be through a field on a rough dirt road. We were surprised to find out that nobody had heard of Mossy Glen. They couldn't understand why 4 high schoolers suddenly showed up in town asking about it. We didn't pay much attention and continued down the dirt trail. When we went by the farmhouse again, we noticed that all the lights were off and it looked deserted. I suggested leaving a note on the door to let them know we'd be parking nearby. It's getting late, and out here in the countryside, it's not uncommon to have a homeowner confront you with a shotgun if they find your cars. But since the road ahead is blocked and no one can pass through, parking there wouldn't really be a problem. And we'd still technically be on public land. We walked back down the wooded trail and looked for a spot to camp for the night. As we explored, we realized that the dense forest we saw earlier actually looked much thinner from below. In fact, the dirt path led to a pretty big open space with a creek and a small waterfall flowing through the limestone. We couldn't believe we hadn't noticed it earlier. Then Bill had a thought. He went around the corner into the trees and came back to the top of the trail a few minutes later. Even though we could see Bill clearly, the trees were lined up in a way that blocked his view of anything below the ledge. As we walked up the creek, we noticed that there were rocks conveniently placed at just the right distance from each other. We could step on them without causing any ripples in the water or disturbing the rocks around us. You could walk up and down the creek almost silently because the sound of the water covered the sound of your steps. We didn't think much of it and took some pictures of the big boulders covered in moss. We got some really nice scenic shots. We found a spot to set up camp, and everything was going well until we reached the waterfall. Right before the waterfall, there was a clear spot with no big rocks, just an unusual setup of logs. One log lay flat, held up by rocks at each end. In front, There was a rough circle made of stones, with a pile of burnt logs inside, a fire pit with a bench nearby. It was unexpected at first, but we figured it must have been a weekend project put together by the people who lived in the nearby house. Well, with such a cool spot nearby, why not make something like this at home, right? I have a fire pit at home too, so I wasn't too worried. But then Kyle yelled from a boulder a few yards ahead, "Hey, what's this?" On the boulder sat an orange beanie, a gardening glove, an empty beer can, and a well-worn stick of deodorant. Taking a closer look at the beer can, we noticed it had been opened recently. There was still fresh foam at the bottom and it smelled strong. We were all puzzled by what we found. Jake began searching around the other side of the boulders upstream from the items. "Wow, there's a cave," he shouted to us, saying the cave was big enough for someone to fit in comfortably. Even more disturbingly, he saw some red fabric inside. Before Jake could explore further, Kyle called us over urgently. He spoke quietly, indicating that we shouldn't shout back. "Shampoo," he whispers urgently, pointing at his feet. Sure enough, there's a blue bottle of Suave shampoo lying in the mud and leaves next to the creek. At this point, we're all really freaked out. I'm ready to call it quits and head back. But Bill thinks it's just junk left behind by the people at the house after a weekend, maybe after a few too many drinks. But something doesn't make sense to me. There's one detail I haven't mentioned yet. The day before got a lot of rain, which would have made everything wet, including the mud on the road and trail. With the wind and rain, the items on the rocks should have been wet or even moved around. Also, it was pretty cold outside, like it always is this time of year. It didn't even reach above the mid-40s all week. Then, suddenly, everything started to make sense to me. Whoever drank the beer and left the shampoo, hat, glove, and deodorant likely did it earlier that morning. The fire pit also had fresh burn marks on the rocks, and the wood looked like it hadn't been wet for a while. So, it must have been lit at the earliest last night. The small cave would have been a dry shelter from the rain, without the freezing temperatures we had all day. Whoever was using shampoo out here must have had few other options. If it was the homeowners, they would have been really strange to bathe in the shallow, freezing, rocky creek, instead of at home. If it wasn't them, then we probably weren't alone right now. Whoever left these things behind must have left in a hurry. If they were here just 4 hours ago, they would have been able to see us on the trail cliff long before we even knew they were down here. Remembering how the rocks were set up in the stream, they might have been leaving their camp even. Just as we were coming down the dirt trail, I began to think about this. I looked around and noticed that the small area was surrounded by thick trees on one side, big boulders on the other by the pond, and limestone cliffs everywhere else. Because of all the trees, rocks, and hills around, you could light a fire in the pit at night without anyone seeing it. And nobody nearby would even have a clue. The trick of being able to see up the dirt trail from the camp, but not down, worked the opposite way from the cliffs. If you were wearing brown or green, you could easily see down from the rocks on top of the camp below while blending in with the trees above. As I figured this out, I noticed something else. Something more scary was happening. The birds and small animals that we heard before were now quiet, except for the gentle sound of the creek. The whole place was completely silent. As I started to explain this to the others, I could see them thinking the same thing. Jake began to head back to the small cave when we heard rustling up on the limestone ridge. Something big was moving around up there, something that seemed to not want Jake to see what was in the cave. We all looked up, but whatever or whoever made the noise started shuffling down the ridge toward our camp. Something more scary was happening. The birds and small animals that we heard before were now quiet, except for the gentle sound of the creek. The whole place was completely silent. As I started to explain this to the others, I could see them thinking the same thing. Jake began to head back to the small cave when we heard rustling up on the limestone ridge. Something big was moving around up there, something that seemed to not want Jake to see what was in the cave. We all looked up, but whatever or whoever made the noise started shuffling down the ridge toward our camp. Because of the high cliff, the only way down to us would be to go all the way back down to the pond and then double back up the stream. When we realized this and freaked out at how exposed we were, we sprinted back down the stream, up the dirt path across the field, and back to our cars. On the drive back to Edgewood, we all tried to understand what had just happened. I looked at a satellite map, and the only easy way to get to the cliff where we heard the noise would be to walk up there from the pond. It was too rough and rocky to come from the field next to the east. Whatever made that noise must have been big. It's possible a deer could get up there, but I'm not sure. It would have been really strange timing for whatever was up there to start moving, just as Jake looked at the cave and the red fabric inside. Kyle found a report about an escaped prisoner from a nearby prison a few weeks ago. He thought maybe it was his camp we found, but we all had doubts about that idea. To ease his worries, we decided to report the strange thing we found to the police, but anonymously, because at that point we just wanted to get home. None of us followed up with them, and I doubt anything came of it. The small town police department probably gets reports of weird things all the time. The fact that 4 high schoolers parked outside a farmer's house for a few hours and then left on the same day doesn't sound like serious criminal activity to me. But things still don't seem to make sense. Until I checked my GPS again. The route it took us on was an old entrance to the park that had been closed off when the lake area was bought up. This happened sometime between when Google's navigation maps were last updated and the day we visited. The actual entrance to the park is about 2 miles north of where the GPS sent us, thinking it was a quicker route. The place we ended up at was still public land, but it wasn't exactly what we expected.